Welcome to the next episode of the Existential Files with Louie Savva. Hello, Louie.
Hello, Matthew. I thought we're not doing silly voices again, are we?
Oh, that's my normal voice. Having just almost coughed up a lung beforehand. So we're joined today, and I have to say this, we're joined again today by Professor Chris French. And any of you listeners, we assume we have more than one, we could be wrong, going back, I'll go back and find the earlier ones. They didn't kind of quite get recorded. They were very good ones. We did talk about weird science and the science of weird shit, forthcoming book, we hope, from Professor Chris French. And we talked about David Mandel, who, in a very much earlier one on the podcast series Lou and I talked about, the man who paints the future. I don't think we're planning to kind of go over those topics again. If they come up, then great. So first of all, hello, Chris. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, my pleasure.
I'm doing a double check with my technical assistant, Louie. We're recording, okay? We're definitely recording, aren't we?
Sidekick Savva says, "Yeah, we're good to go."
No, you're very much the lead man in the driving seat. Is there any particular thing that you would like us to press Chris on? And just as a clarity for any listeners, is that so Chris was your PhD supervisor.
That's right.
But we don't like to talk about that these days because it took so long. Anyway, Chris very nearly was what PhD supervisor for myself. Now talking, I think we're probably going back to about 1993. So what's that? 24 years ago. Riley.
Yeah.
So very nearly the PhD in looking at paranormal belief. So your area is obviously in the area of anomalistic psychology. Anybody could Google you and find it's the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit at Goldsmiths.
Yep.
And in fact, I'm going to pick up on something here because there seems to be, I get the idea now that Goldsmiths, we use the word hotbed. There's quite a lot going on there in terms of some interesting stuff. So including your stuff, there's the people, there's the, is it Gustav Kuhn who's looking at the psychology of magic and deception?
Can I just add, we've Itai's episode has just gone live. So we had a little chat with Itai Witzen, bless you. And he was also...
Can you say his surname, Chris? Can you say his surname?
I'd go for Ibbotson, yes.
I think you're pretty good with that one.
And he was also... And Chris, you were also Itai's PhD supervisor, I believe.
I was indeed, yeah.
There you go.
Yep.
So just
look at that. All these bright people that you're supervising, and Louie.
Yeah.
Very impressive.
We've got Chrissy coming on soon to talk to us as well. So again, we're scraping the bottom of the barrel, academically speaking, with some of your students there, Chris.
Well, I'm sure Chrissy would love that then to hear you use that phrase.
I'm talking about myself there, by the way. Yeah. This is the thing.
Moving on. I got this impression, obviously at the time, even when going back, so again, it would have been early 2000s when Itai and Louie. And you had a few other PhD students, but it seems to be that Goldsmith has been, I say currently a lot going on, and back then. So do you get a sense that being at that university, Chris, has really helped you develop in the way you have in terms of doing this kind of work on anomalistic psychology?
Well, it's quite interesting, Matt, that, for a long time when I'd kind of got into all this stuff, which, I suppose if we're going to date it, I've told this story many times before, but, I used to be a believer in a lot of this stuff, probably most of this stuff. And it was reading one particular book that made me kind of flip to being a skeptic. It was James Alcock's Parapsychology, Science or Magic. I read that in the early 80s when I was doing my PhD, which was in a completely different area. It was on cerebral asymmetry, using EEG, and et cetera, et cetera. And somebody just recommended this book, said, I enjoyed this book, think you'd like it too. I read it and was hooked. What Alcock was doing was presenting a very critical assessment of parapsychology and also putting forward what sounded to me like quite plausible alternative explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. And so it was from that point I kind of suddenly realized there was a skeptical literature out there, even though before that I hadn't really been fully aware of it. So, and what started off as a hobby, I kind of subscribed to Skeptical Inquirer and the kind of British equivalent version, The Skeptic, which was just set up around about that time. And things were happening, but it was all very small scale. There was skeptics in the pub started up around then. But for a long time, as I say, it was just a hobby. It was a side interest. And then occasionally I would do a little project and maybe, publish the odd thing here and there. I think the first thing I published was probably in the early 90s, the Do Sheep and Goat Think Differently in the Psychologist. And my feeling then was that my interest in this stuff was kind of tolerated but not encouraged. In fact, I was more or less told as much, so I had to keep a parallel stream of respectable psychological research going, which I did for many, many years. And it was only, I don't know, I think I started teaching my course at Goldsmiths as part of the BSc, probably about mid-90s. APRU was founded in 2000. It wasn't really until then that I decided it was the weird stuff that really interested me. And I wish I'd have kind of been brave enough to actually make that decision earlier on, rather than keeping, research going in areas like cognition and emotion and so on, which were interesting, but didn't really float my boat as much. So in short answer to your question, which is too late now because you've had a very long answer, is that in the early days, it was tolerated but not encouraged. I think that's changed now. And I think that Goldsmiths is actually quite pleased that they've got the anomalistic psychology research unit. We get a lot of media coverage. We do a lot of public engagement and so on and so forth. And I think those things have become a lot more important over the years to universities. So now it's actually positively encouraged, less so back in the day. And
that's even though your approach is one, again, it's very firmly within that, let's use the term, skeptical approach. You're bringing a psychologist's perspective to these kinds of experiences. And it's not as if you're out there necessarily saying, well, whilst we're open-minded to the possibility that some of these may indicate genuine paranormal things going on or whatever it might be, the thrust, the emphasis is on, as a psychologist, people report these kinds of experiences, people make these kinds of claims, it's fair game to study from a so-called scientific perspective. Even that approach, you felt at the time was, yeah, okay, you're okay to look at that. You weren't out there saying, I think there's weird stuff going on here that we need to validate. We wanted to just explore and look at how psychologists can understand it. And even that you felt as though it was only tolerated at the time rather than positively encouraged.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that did, I must admit, again, it's kind of, from my point of view, it was interesting that initially, having read James Alcock's book and then subscribing to Skeptical Inquirer, reading Randy, reading kind of Ray Hyman, all these other kind of big name skeptics, I think I went from being a believer to being kind of what I would now view as being a fairly kind of extreme skeptic, and kind of had the views that kind of all parapsychologists were complete nincompoops, didn't know the first thing about experimental design and statistics and so on. I'm not necessarily blaming the books that I've read there and the magazines, but they did, it was a universally kind of negative attitude towards parapsychology. It was only as I gradually began to actually meet some of these parapsychologists, people like Bob Morris and Caroline Watt and so on and so forth, and you realise, well, actually, these seem like quite sensible people, and they really do know about statistics and experimental design. And my attitude kind of changed then, and I ended up in a situation where I have a hell of a lot of respect for the parapsychologists who actually are kind of sympathetic towards paranormal claims, because you actually have to have quite a lot of courage to stand up there and say, well, I think that precognition might be real, or that telepathy might be real, because you know that a lot of your academic colleagues will basically ridicule you. So as I say, I had the kind of experience of people. There's more like an attitude of, why are you wasting your time on this stuff? We all know that telepathy isn't real, that people aren't really being abducted by aliens, blah, blah, blah. And now I've got the kind of arguments very well rehearsed as to why actually we really should be interested in this stuff, whether it's real or not. But as I say, I've got a lot of respect for people like Bob Morris, Caroline Watt, and so on, who actually are prepared to say, well, I think there might be something in some of these claims. They are worthy of further investigation. And
so, Louie, I'm coming to you here at the moment. Is there a question you want to ask here about theism?
Yeah,
I mean, between that and parapsychology.
I remember when I used to be a big believer. I mean, Chris knows this. I used to be a believer in the paranormal. I think that's fair to say. I mean, I was a kind of card-carrying member of the Society for Psychical Research, and And I wasn't a skeptic in the way that Chris was or is. And then I kind of quit parapsychology. I think one of the reasons I quit is because I kind of felt that other parapsychologists were, I've called them kind of theists in, wolf's clothing, and
Sheep's clothing, surely.
Well, whatever, or that parapsychology was kind of backdoor theism. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, Chris. Is that me being unfair, or do we think ultimately, they are looking for is parapsychology a soul science?
Well, I mean, certainly that's a position that James Alcock's taken, isn't it? He wrote a very a big review article. I think the subtitle was, The Search for the Soul, talking about parapsychology. I think it might well be for some people, but I don't think necessarily all parapsychologists are kind of closet theists. And in a sense, it almost doesn't matter whether they are or not, because, at the end of the day, what would matter is, are they doing good science? And, is there actually any evidence for telepathy or any of these other things that we're talking about? I don't really think it matters too much where the ideas come from. It's important in the sense that it helps you maybe to understand why somebody might be particularly firmly wedded to a particular view. I suppose the theism angle would come in, particularly if you were talking about matters related to life after death. Because obviously that's got such strong overlap with religious beliefs that we can't pretend it isn't there. If you're talking about things like precognition or telepathy or even alien abduction claims, then I think there's a lot of atheists who may well believe in a lot of those phenomena. So I don't really think, as I say, you might be right. I think you're almost certainly right with respect to some. I can think of some people who are very influential parapsychologists who, do have very firm religious beliefs as well, and no doubt see one set of beliefs as reinforcing the other. But I don't think it's across the board. There must be some research on this, Louie. And
I want to come to you, Louie, in terms of, because we've had this conversation before. Again, forgive me if it's off air, on air, I don't know. But the reason why you feel as though that could be an issue is because, does it suggest that the whole endeavour is one trying to prove something or explore something which actually isn't appropriate to be linked with those beliefs? Because is there a sense that maybe people who are doing so-called research, scientific research, if they're doing it from a point of view of saying, I'd like to find some data, something empirically that supports my worldview, then it becomes, the word, tarnished in some way?
Let's take Susan Blackmore, for example. And Susan Blackmore was a very big believer in the paranormal. I remember reading her book. What was that book? What's her book called? The Spirit of the Light, something?
Yeah.
The Adventure to the Light, is it? Adventure of a Parapsychologist, that one.
And I read that, and I was just blown away by how, knowledgeable Susan was of parapsychology. And now she isn't. And, I wonder, and maybe we'll get people like Caroline Watt on in the future and ask her, is there anything that, at what point is she going to stop being a parapsychologist? Because I know that, because Chris, you're not actually a parapsychologist, are you, Chris? You don't care if there's a paranormal or not. You're kind of interested in, say, why people might believe, regardless of whether there is an actual, real paranormal going in the first place.
Well, a couple of comments there, Louis. One thing is that Sue's is actually coming back into. I don't think she described herself as a parapsychologist anymore, but she has come back into the field. She's got very interested by the latest research on out-of-body experiences, and she's got a book coming out on out-of-body experiences. So, having left the field all those years ago because she felt that parapsychology wasn't going to answer the questions that she was most interested in, i.e., what is the nature of consciousness, she's now kind of come full circle and decided that actually some of the most recent research really does get at some of those questions, and she's come back in again, but probably would not describe herself, that's what I'd have to ask Sue, obviously, but probably would not describe herself as a parapsychologist. And as you say, I typically do not describe myself as a parapsychologist. I prefer to be described as an anomalistic psychologist, even if nobody has the slightest idea what that means. And it's really a way of kind of labeling myself as saying, I'm interested in this stuff, but I'm a skeptic. Whereas a lot of people who are happy with the label parapsychologist, like say Caroline Watt as an example, not only does she do studies that are meant to directly test paranormal claims, she's also done a lot of studies that look at possible psychological aspects of belief as well. So, I mean, when we do the same thing, it's just a kind of matter of emphasis more than anything else. But I think those labels are really there to kind of, particularly people who insist on calling themselves anomalistic psychologists like myself, it's to kind of put a flag up to say, I'm a skeptic, I don't believe in this stuff.
And I want to pick up on what Louie said there as well, because using it, saying, well, you don't really care about whether it's real or not as such, the paranormal exists, which implies that people who would be described as parapsychologists kind of work from the assumption there is something there. And that's where, again, I think people like, we'll say it's Caroline Watts, who's currently the Cursor Professor of Parapsychology at Edinburgh University. Prior to that, some years ago, there was Bob Morris again in that same role. In that, I feel, again, we want to bring Caroline on to sort of actually talk about it rather than just put words in her mouth, is if you're looking at that broad range of topics, exploring all different hypotheses surrounding those kinds of experiences, then it's the nature of the topic you're looking at that may define you as being a so-called parapsychologist, not your perceptions of whether or not you think what you're studying reflects this interpretation or that interpretation. That would be my feeling. So that's why, whilst over the years when I was researching parapsychology, I might, in some context, be described as a parapsychologist. Broadly speaking, my degree was in psychology, PhD in psychology. I'll be teaching and working within a psychology department. So often for me, it was arguing it sits within the wider remit of psychology. And now, often for many years, people have had this idea that parapsychology, by its term, suggests it sits beyond or beside psychology. So there could be something about its terminology, as opposed to the way in which you approach this stuff is you're bringing psychologically, derived type methods to exploring those kinds of experiences, alleged phenomena, and so on. So that's one thing I wanted to pick up on there.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the other thing, though, just to pick up on something else that Louie said about this idea that I don't really care one way or the other. It's not actually strictly true. Insofar as, I mean, my wife says I shouldn't be so honest about this, but people say...
Oh, please be honest. Please speak from the heart.
I'm going to be totally honest. People say to me, yeah, but the fact that, you've tested so many psychics and you look at all this stuff, you must want to find something, mustn't you? You're searching for some evidence of paranormal ability. The actual truth is, no, I'm not. When we do some kind of a test of a psychic, and it's often for, say, a TV program and so on, my role in the program is to be the skeptic. And actually, when we get the results in and we find yet again that, hey, there's no evidence of telepathy here, that's the result I wanted. I'd have been embarrassed if we'd actually got results that suggested that maybe this person really was psychic. Now, I hope I would be kind of big enough to be able to get over that embarrassment and say, wow, this is really amazing, and, do some further research and get my Nobel Prize. But, when we're actually running the tests, I am not sitting there thinking, come on, pass this test. I am actually quite happy when they fail the test, because that's what I have said they would do. So, at this point in my career, I have a kind of an intellectual investment in paranormal forces not being real. I've got an emotional investment because I find it embarrassing if we do a test and we actually get positive results. Now, having said that, we perform the tests as fairly as we possibly can. So unless you're going to go for the old, skeptical vibes will inhibit the paranormal line, we do it as fairly as we possibly can. And it's, I honestly would find it kind of, we like to find evidence, we all do, that supports our current worldview. And my current worldview is one that says paranormal forces probably don't exist. So I'm not completely neutral in the sense of I don't care one way or the other. I actually, I do actually have a preference for paranormal forces not existing. But if it turned out they did, if somebody could produce reliable, robust demonstrations that actually telepathy is real, I hope I'd be able to kind of get over that and revise my beliefs. As I say, I've gone from being a believer to being a skeptic. I hope I've still got the flexibility to go back the other way if the evidence justified it.
And I think I think that's really important. Thank you for being honest about that. But I think it's interesting, both you and Louie, and we mentioned Sue Blackmore, it's interesting how people go from that initial thing of like, well, initially, maybe prior to really looking at the evidence or exploring it in depth or whatever, is we start, many of us, and I'm not sure it necessarily describes me. I think I've always been a bit of a fence sitter, as it were. And frankly, it's getting a little bit painful on this fence. This idea that I've not exactly gone from one to the other. And Lou and I were talking earlier about a project that I started, and we're looking at whether or not I kind of dip back into it, which was actually starting as a skeptic, someone who's genuinely curious in all these kinds of things. And I actually go back to that well-known individual, Uri Geller, who back in first of all in the early 70s, and then, for as I was concerned, I think early 80s, reappeared on the scene. And by that time, I was becoming very interested in magic and deception. And here was somebody who's coming on and either doing what seemed to be relatively simple so-called magic tricks, the spoon-bending type stuff, but getting a world behind him, or a lot of the people, popularising, thinking, well, I wonder if this stuff is for real. And that's kind of where I was as a teen, is that, well, it looks like it's a trick, but I wonder if it could be. I wonder if it could be. What are the implications that might be, and how you might do that, or if it's a fantastic magic trick or a simple one, but you get everybody believing. To me, that's that blurring between one and the other that really kind of fascinates me, because it'd be great to have answers either way, but there was something about it which captured me. So it wasn't someone thinking, oh, I believe in this stuff, I need to go and research it to either find out if it's true or learn more about it. It was a genuine kind of curiosity that, if anything, then I led to being labelled skeptic, like yourself and like Louie. When we've done sort of TV things, you're there as the quote skeptic, and it's often as a bit of a dirty word, as you're just a skeptic, you just don't believe in these things. And you're genuinely actually being just doubtful, like we are trained to as scientists and so on, is to go, well, what's the evidence that supports it? And so often the evidence just isn't really very strong. Even within experimental parapsychology over the years, you'll see some debates saying, oh, there's something really interesting here. But in the grand scheme of it, there's not very strong empirical evidence that anybody could look at and go, well, there you go. You can't really deny that, can you? And that's really one of the reasons why I stepped away from it, thinking, well, I'm not sure what would really convince me or be convincing to a wider scientific community there is something here that is, in quotes, real or really worth exploring further.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. I mean, I have actually kind of written about what would convince me, to move from a position where I think that paranormal forces probably don't exist to a position where I thought they probably did exist. And it was quite interesting in that respect, looking at some of Dean Radin's writings, because he's one of these people, very obviously, as you both know, a very vocal proponent of parapsychology, and made some kind of quite brave predictions that I think was by the year 2015, it may have been 2016, but by then we'd probably be seeing some pieces of technology that were actually based on paranormal forces, and that we might find out that the Chinese have been doing all this research that's all proving that it's all real, and so on and so forth. And of course, that date has now passed. I've not heard anything from Dean to say that he's kind of saying, oh, well, maybe I was wrong on that. But something like a piece of technology, I mean, that would shut skeptics up. There's some piece of technology that was based on the existence of paranormal forces and couldn't function any other way. But even, I like to keep it as simple as possible. I mean, let's we're talking about Sue Blackmore and her interest in out-of-body experiences. For centuries, there have been claims that certain people could actually induce an out-of-body experience more or less at will. Now, if that's the case, we just need one of those people, just one, who can sit in a chair, have an out-of-body experience, and tell us what's in the next room. That's it. That will shut the skeptics up. There's absolutely no comeback from that. It's never happened. And that in itself speaks volumes to me, that we're probably not dealing with a real experience where consciousness actually leaves the physical body. We're dealing with a hallucinatory experience.
And that's where I come in terms of saying, well, people are using the out-of-body experience as one example of, say over the years, people report the experience. So the experience itself is the phenomenon. That's what you've got to study. And therefore, part of it is looking at what it means to the experience, how it affects them, what is the experience itself, how do they describe it, what's the phenomenology of it, and that kind of thing. And one of the questions could be, if the experience feels that something does actually leave the body and go elsewhere, then again, that's an empirical question. And some will argue there has been research over the years that has always, and again, I think some of Sue's early stuff, and I think even Bob Morris may have even done some work with people, when there are people who claim they can do it at will. So you can bring them into a lab environment and say, okay, well, you say you can do it. Now you're in here, we're going to put you in this room, and if you genuinely believe that you can go to another room, or part of you can, your consciousness can, or whatever it might be, and pick up information there, that should be very, very straightforward. And I just don't know whether or not lots of people are trying these things and not finding anything, or whether it's just too far out there that only a small number of people over the years have even bothered to try it. So yes, so I agree that actually, in terms of demonstrating, confirming that something definitely leaves the body in the way we would sort of typically envisage it, then that should be quite an easy to test hypothesis. And interesting, actually, we have a PhD student starting later this year who's looking at some of these experiences. But again, someone who's had experiences themselves. So one of the challenges will be, to what extent can we do what feels like science on it, as in something where you're testing a hypothesis, or will it be very psychological and exploratory to say, well, what's the experience like? And again, from our perspective, in terms of looking at its impact upon people's well-being and health, how does it affect people? Because often people have these experiences, the other one being near-death experiences, and whether or not something happens that can confirm their experience, often afterwards they are affected quite significantly by it. And that's also interesting from a psychological perspective. What is it about the experience that changes them? So one can still do science on these things without necessarily being, I believe something to be the case and I want to test it to support it, or I think it's not, there's nothing of that nature happening, I want to kind of almost debunk it. You can still genuinely explore these experiences, and it's meaningful, worthwhile science in that broader context of knowing that, Louie and I will talk about, well, is anything meaningful? Does anything have meaning? What's the point of anything? But as much as anything else does, that's a worthwhile endeavour as part of a scientific approach.
I agree, yeah, entirely. I mean, there's no doubt at all that, in my mind at least, that near-death experiences have long-term transformative effects on people's lives. And that in itself is fascinating and interesting and worthy of serious research. So again, you're not doubting the experience typically in these kind of situations. You might have particular views about the nature of the experience, and they're perfectly legitimate questions to ask, but also just, as you say, in the effects of the experience. So, I mean, to my mind, the fact that paranormal experiences have been reported in kind of every known society, geographically and historically, and that paranormal beliefs are at a high level in most societies, that means there's something there of interest for psychologists. Either at least some of these claims genuinely are paranormal in the sense that they would defy any explanation in terms of conventional science, and if that's the case, well, wow, that's really interesting. And if not, we can learn a lot about human psychology by studying them and thinking about them and trying to understand them. So either way, they're worth taking seriously.
Absolutely. I noticed that Louie's gone very quiet. Louie, are we anything to add here, or should we pause at this point and then pick up some of these ideas in the next episode?
I think that sounds like a good idea.
So thank you, Chris, for that. Appreciated.
My pleasure.
Yep, thank you very much, Chris.
Catch up with you again very soon. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.